By dawn, her left heel had rubbed open inside her shoe, and each step toward Chancery Lane pressed fresh pain through wet leather into bone. But Rebecca Webber did not slow, because if she arrived after the clerk, she would be marked insolent before her father's name was even spoken. Mud streaked the lower half of her skirt, where carts had churned the road through the night. Rain had ended before first light, yet water still dripped from every cornice and iron rail, and the hem of her plain brown dress drank from each puddle like cloth condemned to drowning. She carried the iron deed box against her ribs with both arms, the black metal cold enough to numb her fingers through threadbare gloves, and the weight bowed her shoulders so that from a distance she looked less like a daughter in mourning than a hired porter, paid too little to complain. Men always noticed the wrong thing. 2 coachmen near the arcade arch laughed when she passed, not loudly, but with the low, practised cruelty of men certain no one would correct them. One said that plain girls should keep to kitchens and back stairs, not walk where barristers took morning air. The other asked whether the box held pies. Rebecca kept her eyes on the slick stones ahead and counted her steps between drains, because she had learned years ago that silence cost less than answer. Her stomach was hollow and sour from last night's crust of bread. Her throat burned with the acid of it. She had eaten standing in the passage outside the still-room while the household slept, then gone to the schoolroom desk to copy invoices until the candles guttered. When she shifted the deed box from right arm to left, she felt the skin split again along 2 fingers, paper cuts reopened by rust and rain. The cuts stung as if salted. She did not look at them. Under the covered arcade before the probate office, gentlemen stamped moisture from polished boots, while servants held umbrellas high enough to keep wigs dry. Rebecca stood apart near a cracked pillar where water blew inward in thin silver lines and darkened her sleeves to the elbow. No one offered her room by the wall. No one asked whether she needed to sit. Her knees trembled once and locked. She had slept 3 hours in the attic room above the old nursery, in blankets that smelled of dust and old lavender, without coal in the grate because Mrs. Webber had declared fuel a waste on a girl who produced no dowry and no invitations. The order had come in the same tone she used to discuss spoiled cream, practical, final. Supper had ended for Rebecca soon after. A tray no longer came upstairs. If she wished to eat, she waited until the kitchen had dismissed the last dish and asked cook for what could not be sold to pigs. Sometimes cook slipped her broth. More often there was nothing to slip. The larger cruelty came after midnight, when the household books were brought up in a stack, and she was told to copy each line in a neat hand by morning because ingratitude must learn discipline. Ink had eaten the pads of her fingers to tenderness. Lye water had cracked the skin between thumb and forefinger, where she washed nibs and wiped ledgers clean for recopying. She had become useful in ways that left no record. In the arcade, a young barrister glanced at her hands and then away quickly, as if raw skin might be catching. A woman in dove-grey silk lowered her voice to whisper that the Weber stepdaughter looked even thinner than rumour. Rebecca heard every word and folded deeper around the box, chin bent, dark hair loosened by rain against her cheek. She did not cry. Tears would have warmed her for 1 moment and shamed her for 3 days. The ruin had not happened in 1 blow. It had come by measured subtraction, polite at first, then efficient. Her mother had died of fever when Rebecca was 11, leaving books with her own notes in the margins, and 1 silver comb no one could sell because Rebecca hid it in the lining of an old cloak. Her father had endured that loss with a gentleness that looked like weakness to people who valued volume over principle. He remarried within 2 years. Mrs. Webber arrived with trunks of blue silk and rosewater scent, with 2 daughters old enough to sneer and young enough to enjoy it, with creditors already circling but smiling in her drawing room. At first the changes were small. Rebecca's French lessons were postponed for guests. Her music hour was given to one of the girls because talent should be visible. Her place at table moved 1 chair farther from her father. Then came the debts. Notes she had never seen before appeared with his signature at the bottom. Jewellery left in locked cabinets went missing and returned as excuses. A carriage horse was sold. Then the 2nd horse. Then the silver epergne from her mother's wedding service. As her father's lungs failed, work rose around him like floodwater. He coughed blood into linen and still asked for balance sheets. Rebecca held the books open while he traced columns with a shaking finger, and once, late in winter, when the fire had gone to embers and frost mapped the inside of the panes, he looked at her cramped hand and said, almost impatient with tenderness, that she had the mind of a solicitor and the endurance of a winter horse. He meant to encourage. She held that sentence as others held prayer. After his burial, the schoolroom was emptied. Governess wages were dismissed. Rebecca's dresses were cut down and mended at cuffs that frayed again in a fortnight. She became the hand that copied, the feet that climbed stairs, the back that bent. She became present only when there was blame to assign. In the bright front rooms, her name was spoken as if it were an inconvenience in the china pattern. Yet even then she had kept one narrow province untouched. In the margins of household ledgers, where columns of sugar and lamp oil marched in obedient rows, she copied passages of law from memory when no one watched. Testamentary capacity, revocation by subsequent instrument, witness competency. She had borrowed old manuals from a retired clerk who rented rooms behind the apothecary and returned them wrapped in butcher paper so the maids would think she carried meat. She read while stirring starch, while waiting for ink to dry, while standing in passages where draughts rose through cracked tiles and made her teeth ache. Language gave structure to injury. If a household could erase her socially, statute at least admitted she existed as a person capable of holding property, of being named, of contesting fraud. She knew better than to trust sentiment. Paper mattered, seals mattered, dates mattered. In the week before this morning, she had sorted her father's private index under orders to prepare whatever Mrs. Webber deemed useful for probate. Near the end of the list, between references to lease renewals and a memorandum on tenant arrears, one line sat wrong to the eye trained by repetition. An entry number without a corresponding folder, a space where a second instrument should have rested. The gap was not untidiness. Her father had been too exact for that. The discovery had travelled through her body like cold water poured down the spine. Not fear, recognition. Strategy lived in absences as often as in declarations. She had said nothing. To accuse without document was to hand one's enemy a cleaner knife. So she tied the index pages in ribbon, locked the deed box herself, and walked to London before dawn, because she no longer trusted any carriage ordered from her own door. When the probate clerk finally unlatched the inner gate and called for the Webber parties, the crowd shifted in a rustle of wool and damp silk that sounded like reeds in wind. Rebecca stepped forward last. The hem of her dress left a thin brown mark across the threshold stone. Inside, the chamber smelled of wet coats, lamp smoke, and old paper turned many times by careful hands. Benches filled, quills scratched. Mrs. Webber entered 2 minutes later, with both daughters gloved and dry, jewels like chips of winter light at their throats, rose water preceding them in a soft, victorious cloud. She did not look at Rebecca. She looked over her, as one looks over furniture not worth moving. A clerk reached for the iron box. Rebecca held it 1 second longer than propriety required, long enough to feel the cold press into her palm, long enough to remember her father's hand guiding hers along a legal column when she was 13, and proud of balancing it without error. Then she released it. She sat where directed, spine straight despite the ache along her shoulders, hunger twisting once under her ribs, and then settling into a familiar quiet. Around her, expectation mounted in small bodily signs, heads bent together, fans stilled, glances sharpened. She kept her face composed, pale and unreadable, her large dark eyes fixed on the table where seals would be broken. If her name vanished from the first will, she would not give them surprise as entertainment. She had already learned what this room had not. Omission could be weapon, and it could be map. The first seal broke with a dry snap that travelled farther than the clerk's voice. Rebecca heard it as one hears a bone shift back into joint. Necessary, painful, overdue. The clerk adjusted his spectacles, shook sand from the folded sheet, and began the formal preamble in a tone meant to reassure gentlemen that law moved by order and not by appetite. She listened to each phrase as if she were balancing an account where one wrong figure could ruin a tenant family for winter. Sound narrowed. Wet wool. Ink. The faint clink of Mrs. Weber's bracelets when she resettled her hands. The old grief rose at the edge of the words and pressed behind Rebecca's ribs, not as sudden sorrow, but as the familiar weight she had carried since she was 11, and came into her mother's room after dawn to find every mirror veiled and every servant speaking in whispers too kind to be true. Her mother had smelled of rosemary and starch and clean linen. Her mother had corrected her posture by tapping 2 fingers between her shoulder blades. Her mother had never raised her voice. Fever took her in 4 days. The house never recovered. People called Rebecca fortunate that her father remarried quickly, as though a second wife were a blanket one might throw over winter and call the cold solved. No one who said that had watched a quiet man learn to apologize for occupying his own chair while a new mistress arranged his life into rooms where he no longer fit. The reading continued. Bequests to charities, legacy to a cousin in Bath, mention of plate, mention of rents. Rebecca did not move when heads turned toward her at each omission. Mrs. Weber had trained rooms to perform on cue. A lifted brow from her could make 2 maids deny a fact they had witnessed with their own eyes. Rebecca had learned that in the first month after the wedding, when she came down in her mother's ivory muslin for a summer call and found the elder stepsister already wearing it, sleeves altered, neckline lowered, laughing that it had been left in the mending basket and therefore ownerless. Mrs. Weber had looked over the top of her chocolate cup and said, mild as cream, that Rebecca remembered poorly and should not embarrass herself before guests. The lie stood because silk stood with it. Later came the smaller confiscations that left no scene for anyone to condemn. Her mother's writing desk moved from the blue morning room to the younger girl's chamber for French exercises. The rosewood box of sealing wax disappeared. Her atlas was stripped for maps to decorate a nursery school project that never occurred. The pianoforte key to lock the lid was given to the girls because Rebecca no longer required an instrument. She had no leisure to play. By the 2nd week of October, the year after Mr. Weber's cough first turned red, Rebecca was serving tea in the same drawing room where she had once read aloud to him from Blackstone while rain struck the glass. She carried the tray steady with both hands and stood through songs performed on her mother's stool, while guests praised the daughter's refinement and asked whether the dark one in plain brown was a relation or a useful maid. "Missus, it taught you must, for," Webber answered both at once. "A dependent," she said. "The child has no head for society." No head for society, and yet every creditor found her when bills came. She knew the order of their boots on the back step. She knew which one removed his hat at the kitchen threshold and which kept it on to force an insult into the room without speaking one. She knew the shape of forged urgency. "Madame requests payment by Friday." "Madame assures me the note is valid." "Madame regrets the misunderstanding." Her father had still been alive then, thinner each month, breath cut short after 6 stares, but Mrs. Webber intercepted correspondence and declared it kindness. She told visitors his nerves could not bear business. She told Rebecca that sick men required rest, not arithmetic, and then sent fresh piles of unsigned promissory papers to his bedside with ribbons already tied. Twice Rebecca entered with broth and saw him put his name where his eyes had not lingered. Once she moved the candle closer and watched his hand hesitate above a line she could not read from the door. She remembered the rough cough that followed, the way his shoulders folded inward as if his chest had become a trap. She remembered wanting to cross the room and not crossing it, because Mrs. Webber stood between them with one hand on the bedpost and one on the paper, smiling as if obedience were filial piety. When he slept, Rebecca checked ledgers. Figures failed to balance. Amounts were lifted and repeated under altered dates. Interest appeared where no principal had been recorded. She copied discrepancies onto scraps and hid them in grammar books no one in that household opened. In January, she found her father's signet pressed in warm wax on a note he had been too fevered to leave his room to witness. In February, the jeweller's account listed her mother's pearl eardrops sold to clear a debt incurred for imported lace. In March, the carriage horses were gone, and Mrs. Webber blamed market conditions. In April, the tenants waited in the rain outside the steward's office while the elder stepsister ordered blue silk from Bond Street and complained the shade was provincial. The clerk reached the section addressing the family line. He spoke the words, "My beloved wife," with bureaucratic neutrality, and Mrs. Webber lowered her lashes in practised bereavement. Rebecca's jaw tightened once and released. Beloved had been used by men who wrote with witnesses present. It had also been used by men too tired to fight in rooms where refusal would become another illness to be managed by others. The daughters sat flanking their mother like polished mirrors. The elder wore Rebecca's grandmother's garnet brooch reset in a modern clasp. The younger had tied back her hair with black ribbon cut from mourning trim that had once edged Rebecca's winter mantle. Rebecca saw these things because deprivation had taught her to inventory by sight. Her own mantle now hung in her attic with the lining turned twice and the collar darned where moths had eaten through. Her shoes had paper at the toe under worn leather. Her gloves were her father's old riding gloves cut down and resewn by candlelight. Hunger had given her a private clock. She could tell the hour by whether pain sat low and dull, or sharp and twisting. Today it stayed sharp. She had eaten crust and weak tea. Still she had copied 3 pages of tenant arrears before leaving at first light, because if she failed one task while pursuing another, Mrs. Webber would call it proof that learning made women useless. The phrase had been repeated often enough to harden into household law. Girls who read statutes forget their station. Girls who ask for signatures become insolent. Girls without prospects should be grateful for employment under their own roof. On the night after her father's burial, Mrs. Webber had stood at the foot of Rebecca's narrow bed and revised that law into punishment. "You will earn your keep. Now lessons are extravagance. Sentiment is extravagance. Coal is extravagance." The next morning the grate was cold. It stayed cold through 2 winters. Rebecca learned to warm ink by holding the bottle inside her sleeve. She learned to copy ledgers in gloves without smearing figures. She learned to keep her face still when a slap came in a corridor where portraits could not testify. The legal language moved toward dispositive clauses. Benches creaked. A man in the back coughed into a handkerchief. Someone whispered that the girl looked carved from tallow. Rebecca kept her spine straight against the splintered bench and let the memory of her father's hand steady hers. In his last spring, when he could no longer walk to the office, he had her bring him the lease abstracts and the statute volume on settlements. He would listen while she read, eyes shut, then ask one question so exact she understood at once that illness had not dimmed his judgment, only his strength. If a will is executed under pressure, what is required to prove undue influence? If a prior instrument is revoked, where must notice appear to avoid mischief? She answered as she could. He corrected gently when she erred. On one wet evening, when thunder made the windows shake and Mrs. Webber entertained card players downstairs, he had pressed a folded index page into her hand and said, with breath that rattled at each word, "Never trust the packet they put before you if you did not watch it sealed." She had kept that page hidden inside the back board of her psalter until last week, when she matched its reference numbers to the private index and found that absent line where a second instrument should have rested. Her pulse had pounded then as it did now, but she had felt something colder beneath panic. Method. Her father had prepared for theft by arranging a trail only a patient reader would follow. Mrs. Webber believed speed was mastery. Rebecca knew better. Endurance was a slower blade. The clerk paused to wet his lips. Mrs. Webber leaned forward 1/2 an inch, scent of rose water shifting across the table, as if perfume itself expected triumph. The daughters watched Rebecca with openly sharpened interest, hungry for the wince they had been promised. Rebecca gave them none. She had been stripped in public too often to mistake spectacle for danger. Danger wore quieter shoes. Danger came as paper delivered with courtesy. Danger came as a changed lock, a missing key, a dismissed witness, an account copied overnight to hide what noon light would expose. She thought of the attic chest where she had kept her mother's comb, wrapped in flannel beside the scrap slips, listing forged amounts and contradictory dates. She thought of Cook's face, lined and careful, when she whispered that the household butcher had begun demanding cash because promissory paper from Webber House no longer cleared. She thought of old Mr. Hales, the retired clerk near the apothecary, pressing a narrow volume into her hand last month and saying without looking directly at her that registries remembered what drawing rooms denied. Those were her true inheritances so far. 1 comb, 12 scraps, a warning, and law enough to read her enemy's methods even when she could not yet stop them. When the line finally came that left her unmentioned, the room answered as rooms do when social order receives fresh theatre. A breath pulled through 20 mouths at once, a fan snapped shut. One of the daughters let out a small sound of delighted pity and masked it as a sigh. Mrs. Webber did not smile. She did not need to. Satisfaction settled on her like a second silk layer, weightless and visible. Rebecca felt her own heartbeat strike hard twice, then level. No astonishment, no collapse, only confirmation that the first packet had been curated for this effect. She lowered her gaze to the edge of the table where knife marks crossed old polish, and counted 3 scratches, then 7, then 3 again, until the roar of blood in her ears receded and the clerk's voice returned, ordinary and dry. The omission sat where she had expected it. The map held. She lifted her head and looked, at last, directly at Mrs. Webber. The older woman met her eyes with cool disdain and a warning already formed. Rebecca understood both. She also understood that she was not finished merely because they had begun to applaud her erasure. She had just drawn breath to stand when Mrs. Webber rose before the clerk could sand the final line and fold the sheet. Silk whispered. Bracelets clicked once. The movement was so sudden that two men on the rear bench turned, as if a shot had cracked in the chamber. Mrs. Webber did not request leave to speak. She placed one gloved hand on the table's edge and said, clear enough for the corridor to hear, "For avoidance of impropriety, let the record note that Miss Rebecca Webber is no relation of legal consequence to this estate administration. She has occupied Webber House by indulgence. That indulgence is withdrawn." One of her daughters drew in a pleased breath. The younger pressed fingers over her mouth to hide a smile that leaked through anyway. The clerk blinked, offended by breach more than by cruelty, and lifted his quill without writing. Mrs. Webber turned her head half an inch toward a waiting solicitor Rebecca had not seen enter. He stepped forward at once, produced a folded paper already sealed, and held it out as if presenting a calling card. "Service copy," he said. "Vacate by sunset." The words landed with the weight of a door bar falling into place. Rebecca accepted the notice because refusing it would change nothing, and because trembling hands always pleased people like this. She would not feed them. The paper was thick, expensive ragstock, smelling faintly of starch and rose water. Her name was written in a clerk's formal hand, then scratched once and rewritten without miss. A small humiliation, deliberate and precise. She read the first lines while standing. Unlawful occupancy, immediate surrender of personal effects, access to all family records revoked. At the bottom, where witness signatures should have sat in clean sequence, one line slanted slightly uphill, as though signed in haste. She folded the notice along the existing crease and slipped it inside her cuff. Mrs. Webber extended her hand toward the iron deed box with a softness that carried more threat than shouting. "Give that here." Rebecca didn't move. "It belongs to the estate," Mrs. Webber said. "You have touched enough things above your station." "It belongs to my father's file until the clerk receipts transfer," Rebecca answered, voice low, formal, stripped of heat. "I will surrender it to officers of this court." A rustle passed through the benches. Insolence, they would call it. She called it correct procedure. Mrs. Webber's expression did not change, but colour rose under the powder at her throat. "You mistake persistence for standing. You have neither. Leave now. Use the back stairs. I will not have you creating a scene." Rebecca looked at the clerk, not at her stepmother. "Sir, do you require the box at this table or in your registry room?" The clerk hesitated only a moment, then said, "Registry room." He gestured toward the side door. "Bring it yourself." For the first time that morning, Mrs. Webber's control slipped in public. Her fingers closed on the air where the box had been. "Do not indulge her theatrics." The clerk cleared his throat and spoke with the brittle dignity of a man who had found his rules useful again. "Madame, the court indulges process." Rebecca lifted the box before anyone could rethink it. Metal dragged against wood. Her heel flared in her shoe. She held her face still and walked out through the side passage, not because she had won anything, but because she had prevented a theft 1 minute longer. The corridor beyond the chamber was narrower than it looked from the arcade, stone-walled and already filling with departing bodies, wet coats, legal satchels, impatience. Rain had returned in hard, slanting lines that blew under the arches and struck the floor in dark coins. By the time she reached the staircase landing, the crowd had thickened at both ends. Servants searching for masters, masters shouting for hats, clerks pressing files against their chests like shields. Mrs. Webber followed fast enough that the scent of rosewater reached Rebecca before her words did. "Stop where you are!" Rebecca kept moving toward registry. "Did you not hear me?" She turned then, because a hand had caught her sleeve. Not Mrs. Webber's, the elder daughter's. Nails bit through damp fabric into Rebecca's arm. "Mother asked you a question," the girl said, smile gone now, voice thin with anger. "Who gave you leave to answer before, gentlemen?" Rebecca disengaged her sleeve without wrenching. "Take your hand away." Mrs. Webber arrived at her shoulder, silk darkened at the hem where rain had touched it, face composed again for spectators. "You may pretend obedience in court. You will not pretend it in my hearing. You are out by sunset. If a single paper is missing from my office, I will have you searched in the street." A few heads turned. A footman carrying dispatches slowed to watch. The old panic rose in Rebecca's throat and hardened there. Public shame no longer shocked her. It exhausted her. "Then send your maid to witness my trunk," she said. "I keep nothing of yours." Mrs. Webber's laugh was soft and sharp. "You keep breath in rooms paid for by me. That debt ends tonight." She reached for the deed box again, not bothering now to hide the snatch. Rebecca pivoted, metal scraping stone as she pulled it clear. The younger daughter hissed something near Rebecca's ear about attic rats and beggar blood. Mrs. Webber lifted her hand. The slap did not land. A new sound struck the corridor first, a blunt thud against wood, then a choking cry that broke midway. Bodies shifted toward the staircase. A small boy in a navy coat had fallen against the lower banister and slid sideways onto the landing stones, one arm trapped beneath him at an angle no arm should hold. His face had gone from red to a frightening grey. A sweet wrapper clung wetly to his lip. Two footmen lunged, then froze when he jerked and made no full breath. Rebecca set the deed box down and crossed the distance in 3 strides. Her knees hit stone. Cold soaked through her skirts at once. "Move back," she said to no one and everyone. "Give him air." One footman stammered, "Master Henry, my lady, he was running, he swallowed." "Do not pull him upright," Rebecca snapped. "Support his neck." The boy's eyes rolled toward her and unfocused. His mouth worked without sound. She slid one arm behind his shoulders, turned him carefully to clear his throat, and swept her fingers through his mouth, deeper than comfort, ignoring the bite of small teeth and the gag that followed. A lump of sugared almond shot out, struck the floor, and spun into a puddle. The boy dragged in a ragged breath that whistled and caught. Then another. Relief rippled through the onlookers in a scattered murmur that felt indecently loud. "Slowly," she whispered to him, though her own pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her wrists. "Again," he breathed. His chest hitched, then steadied to frightened sobs. When he tried to move, he screamed and clutched at his shoulder. Rebecca saw the left arm sag wrong at the joint. She looked up. "I need cloth." No one moved quickly enough. She reached to her own petticoat hem, tore a long strip with both hands, and folded it into a sling while rain blew across her bowed head and plastered dark hair to her cheek. The fabric gave with a ripping sound that silenced the last whisper in the corridor. Aristocratic flesh in a stranger's lap, a stepdaughter in rags giving orders to liveried men. It was the kind of scene people carried home and repeated at supper for weeks. "Hold this," she told the nearest footman, placing his hand where the boy's forearm must be supported. "Not higher, not lower. If he faints, keep his side turned." The footman obeyed without argument, white-faced. Behind her, Mrs. Webber found her voice again. "Rebecca, stand up! This instant! You will not touch him!" Rebecca did not turn. Boots pounded under the archway from the street entrance. Fast, heavy, purposeful. Conversation died as if a hand had closed over the corridor's mouth. A man crossed the threshold at a run, water streaming off a dark greatcoat, hat gone, hair wine-thrown and black against a face cut hard enough to look carved from wet stone. He was tall as the door-frame, broad through shoulders built by drill rather than tailoring, and a pale scar ran from his right temple into his hairline like a strike of winter lightning. His eyes found the boy first, then the woman kneeling in muddy skirts with torn linen wrapped around his nephew's arm. He stopped so abruptly the heel of his boot skidded on wet slate. "Do not move him!" The command cracked clean through the rain noise. Rebecca looked up into eyes the colour of river water under storm. Recognition hit not by acquaintance but by rank and rumour converging at once. Everyone in that corridor knew that face from distance, if not from introduction. Lucian Ashford, Duke of Arden, who had returned from the peninsula with half his regiment buried and never smiled in public thereafter. Men stepped back without being told. Even Mrs. Webber's daughters went very still. Rebecca kept one hand under the boy's neck and answered before caution could catch her tongue. "If your grace wishes him alive, his shoulder must be held as it is. He choked. I cleared it." For a heartbeat she expected rebuke. She expected a guard's hand on her collar. She expected to be reminded in front of everyone where she stood. The Duke dropped to one knee opposite her, coat darkening at once where rain hit wool, gaze flicking over the boy with military precision, breathing, colour returning, pupils responsive, arm displaced. He did not waste words on panic. "Henry, look at me!" The child blinked through tears. "Uncle, stay still!" Henry whimpered and tried to curl toward Rebecca instead. She tightened the sling knot and murmured, "Do not twist. You are doing well." The Duke's jaw flexed once. He turned his head without looking away from the boy. "Where is Dr. Vale?" a groom answered from behind the crowd. "Fetching, your grace. He is in chambers above." "Now!" The groom ran. Only then did the Duke look directly at Rebecca. Rain traced from his hair to the angle of his cheek and dropped from his chin to the stone between them. Up close, the scar pulled slightly when he narrowed his eyes. His gaze moved from her face to her hands, to the torn petticoat, to the mud up her sleeves, to the bruise darkening at her wrist where fabric had fallen back in the struggle over the box. He did not pretend not to see it. "You are injured," he said quietly. "You were left so." Words she had swallowed for years rose hot and useless behind her teeth. She pressed them down. "It is nothing, your grace." "Liar!" He said it without cruelty, as plain fact, then shifted his attention as Dr. Vale arrived, breathless, with case in hand. The physician crouched, assessed, and gave Rebecca one sharp nod after checking Henry's airway. "Who cleared him?" "I did," Rebecca said. "You prevented asphyxia." He touched the sling, tested alignment with careful fingers, and looked up at the Duke. "Shoulder likely dislocated, not fractured. She held him correctly. Keep him exactly so until we reduce it indoors." The corridor exhaled as if granted permission. Mrs. Webber moved forward, recovered enough to claim territory. "Your Grace, this girl has overstepped in every possible respect. She is no one. My household matter need not concern—" Arden stood in one smooth motion, and his height turned her sentence to fragments. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Who are you?" The question landed harder than insult. "Mrs. Edmund Weber," she said, drawing herself up. "Widow. Executor." His eyes shifted once to the deed box on the floor, then back to her. "You struck her." "I corrected impertinence." He held her gaze for 2 beats that felt like measured blows, then addressed the footman nearest him. Bring my carriage to the lower arch. Cushions flat, blankets heated. We move now." Mrs. Webber tried again, sharper. "You cannot remove that child with a stranger in attendance." Arden did not look at her this time. "I can remove my nephew where I choose." He turned to Rebecca. "You will come. Keep his shoulder fixed." Every eye in the corridor swung to her. Refusal would be read as insolence. Acceptance would be read as ambition. Either way, the same mouths would speak by dinner. Henry's fingers had knotted in her torn sleeve and would not release. Rebecca inclined her head once. "Yes, Your Grace." The Duke gave 2 more orders in the clipped cadence of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "Vale, ride with us. Carter, hold that sling exactly as she directs." Then, to another servant already waiting for instruction, "Find the probate clerk. Tell him I require the sealed registry index for Edmund Webber's estate brought under chain to Arden House within the hour. If he refuses, remind him I will ask in writing before magistrates by noon." The servant bowed and vanished into the stairwell. Mrs. Webber's colour drained in visible increments. "On what authority do you interfere in private probate?" Arden finally gave her the courtesy of full attention, and the cold in his expression made the rain feel warm. "On the authority of witnessing an attempted seizure of documents in a public corridor while a child nearly died at your elbow." He glanced once at Rebecca's wrist again. "And on the authority of deciding what I will not overlook." A clock in the outer hall struck 10, each bell muffled by weather. Between chimes, Henry cried out as the pain in his shoulder surged. Rebecca bent over him, steady voice close to his ear, counting breaths. "In through your nose, hold, out, again." His shaking eased by degrees. The Duke watched her count without comment, face unreadable except for the rigid control at his mouth. When the carriage rolled under the arch, wheels hissing on rain-slick stone, Arden stripped off his greatcoat and laid it across Henry's legs before the footman lifted him. "On my mark," Rebecca said. "Support elbow, do not jar." They moved together, careful and awkward and successful. She climbed in after the child because there was no graceful way to do otherwise in soaked skirts and torn petticoat, and the Duke followed last, ducking under the frame, filling the opposite seat with a contained force that altered the air inside the carriage at once. As the door shut and the horses lunged into motion, he leaned to the window, signalled once to the rider waiting in rain, and said, without turning from Rebecca, "You will tell me exactly what was missing from your father's index. You will tell me exactly what was missing from your father's index." The carriage lurched over a rut before Rebecca answered. Henry cried out and clutched at her sleeve with his good hand. She shifted closer, bracing his injured arm against her own ribs so the sling could not slip. Rain rattled the roof in hard, even strikes. "Entry 74, she said, eyes on the child's face, not on the Duke. "Listed as a codicil packet. No corresponding folder in the private file. The numbering before and after was exact. Only that line was empty." Arden watched her for a long beat. Who else knew? "Mrs. Webber ordered me to prepare the index for probate. She did not know I had memorised it." "Answer the question. No one I trust," Rebecca said. "No one at all." Henry whimpered again. Dr. Vale, opposite her, pressed 2 fingers to the boy's pulse and gave a terse nod, as if approving not her words but her grip. "Keep him thus. We are near." The Duke rapped once on the roof with his cane. The coachman urged the horses faster. Through the blurred glass, Rebecca saw the city shift from crowded stone to wider streets, then to iron gates already opening at the Duke's approach. She had expected grandeur. She had not expected silence. Arden House rose from the rain in pale blocks and black windows, too large, too still, as if the building had forgotten how to hold ordinary life. When the carriage stopped under the portico, 4 footmen were waiting with warmed blankets, a shuttered lantern, and a narrow carrying board. "On my count," Dr. Vale said. "Miss Webber directs the shoulder. You obey her." No one objected. No one looked surprised that a mud-streaked woman in a torn hem was giving instructions in the Duke's own entrance hall. They moved when she spoke. She guided Henry's elbow, kept his wrist elevated, and corrected the angle twice with quiet firmness until he was settled on the board without a fresh scream. Arden strode ahead and opened the inner door himself. Heat struck Rebecca first, then light, then the scent of beeswax and cedar and old stone kept dry by money. Her soaked skirts clung to her calves as she followed the carrying board across a tiled vestibule and up a broad stair lined with portraits in heavy gilt. Every surface announced rank. None of it mattered to Henry, who had begun to shake. "Not the blue nursery," the Duke said. "My brother's old room." A housekeeper in grey, straight-backed and sharp-eyed, appeared from a side passage. "Your Grace, the fire is lit and bricks are warming." "Good. Boiling water, clean linen. No laudanum until Vale says, 'At once.'" The room they entered had once belonged to a soldier. Maps were pinned behind glass. A cavalry sabre hung above the mantel. The bed was wide enough for an adult, but made now with smaller pillows and a child's blanket stitched with faded foxes. Henry was laid down. His face was white with pain. Sweat already stood at his upper lip. Dr. Vale set down his case and turned to Rebecca. "Can you hold him through reduction?" "Yes." "Then hold him now." She sat on the bed, drew Henry against her, and anchored his chest with one arm while supporting the injured shoulder with the other. "Look at me," she whispered. "Do not look at your arm. Breathe where I count." Arden stood at the foot of the bed, still as carved granite. "Your Grace," Vale said without looking up, "I need space, not witnesses." The Duke did not move. Rebecca felt Henry tense beneath her before the physician even touched him. She tightened her hold. "Henry, 4 breaths. 1, 2, 3. 4. Vale worked quickly. There was one sickening shift, a sharp cry, then a sudden collapse in the child's resistance as the joint slid back into place. Henry buried his face against Rebecca's shoulder and sobbed until no sound came. "It is in," Vale said. "Splint and sling. Keep him warm. Watch for fever from shock." Rebecca's own hands shook then. 2 brief tremors she could not stop. She pressed them flat against the blanket until they steadied. A maid arrived with linen strips and a basin of steaming water. Another brought broth untouched by salt. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, directed them in a low voice, efficient and unsentimental. Rebecca recognised the kind of competence that kept households from collapse while titled People Performed Control in drawing rooms. "Miss Webber," Dr. Vale said, "you have done the hardest part. I can tend him now." Henry's fingers tightened again around her sleeve. "No!" His voice was raw and child-small. Arden stepped closer. "Henry!" The boy flinched at the sound of command and clung harder to Rebecca. Something passed over the Duke's face then, brief and cutting. Not anger. Something colder and more helpless. Rebecca looked up at him only once. "If your Grace permits, I can remain until he sleeps," he answered at once. "You remain." Vale wrapped the shoulder with careful turns of bandage. Rebecca held the arm as instructed, then checked the knot herself when he finished. Too tight and fingers would numb, too loose and the joint would slip again. She adjusted 1 finger's breadth, and Vale gave another sharp nod. "Correct," he said. "You have done this before." "My father's clerk fell from a trap once," she said. "There was no surgeon near." "You read medicine too." "I read what I can borrow." Arden heard that. His eyes moved to her hands, to the ink stains still caught in the cracked skin, to the welt at her wrist darkening toward purple. "Mrs." Davies approached with a folded gown and a dry shawl. "Miss, if you would step behind the screen, I can have your dress aired." Rebecca glanced at Henry. His breathing had levelled but remained shallow. "I will not leave him." "You cannot sit in wet cloth for hours," the housekeeper said. Arden spoke without turning. "Bring garments here. She changes in this room. No argument." Rebecca opened her mouth to refuse. Pride rose first. Practicality followed. She was cold through to the bone. Cold hands were poor hands for watching a fevered child. "Thank you," she said, formal and careful. Mrs. Davies's expression did not soften, but her eyes did. "I shall fetch plain wool. No pins." By the time Rebecca had changed behind the screen into a simple dark gown too large at the shoulders, Henry had drifted into uneasy sleep. She returned to the bedside and found a tray waiting at the table, broth, bread, and weak tea. "For you, Mrs." Davies said. "I am not hungry." "You are shaking." Rebecca looked down. She was. Arden stood by the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, rain-damp hair now dry at the edges, scar pale against temple. "Eat." It was an order. It was also unmistakably provision. She took 3 spoonfuls of broth and half a heel of bread without tasting either. Her stomach cramped in protest, and then settled into aching gratitude. She set the tray aside and resumed her post with Henry's splintered arm resting across her lap so any shift would wake her at once. The clock on the mantel marked the 1/4 hour with a soft chime. Dr. Vale packed his instruments. "If fever rises above 101, sponge and cool the neck. If he retches, turn him at once. No opiates unless he cannot be calmed. He may wake confused." "He fears sudden noise," Rebecca said, "and dark corners." Vale looked at her sharply. "How do you know?" "He told me in the carriage when your hand was on his pulse and yours was not listening for words." For the first time the physician's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Then I leave him in sound hands." He bowed to the Duke and departed. The room quieted after he left. Rain softened against the window panes. Somewhere below a door opened and shut, as messages moved through the house. Rebecca watched the rise and fall of Henry's chest and counted breaths the way she had counted figures in ledgers for years. Numbers steadied fear. Numbers gave shape to waiting. At 11:30, Henry woke crying, disoriented by pain. Rebecca cooled a cloth, wiped his face and checked his fingers for colour and warmth. Good perfusion, she rebound the lower bandage where he had kicked it loose. He swallowed 2 sips of water and refused broth. She did not force it. At noon, a footman arrived at the door with a sealed dispatch on a salver. He addressed the Duke, but his eyes flicked to Rebecca's hands, as if unsure where authority sat in that room. Arden broke the seal, read, and handed the paper to Rebecca without comment. It was from the probate clerk. Registry index secured. Supplemental packet located in vault hold. Entry 74 sealed under court wax. Transfer suspended pending magistrate review at request of His Grace the Duke of Arden. Chain of custody witnessed by 2 officers and 1 deputy registrar. Rebecca read every line twice, the words blurred once. She blinked and they sharpened again. "Is it real?" Arden asked. "Yes." Her voice came thinner than she intended. "It exists." "Good." He took back the dispatch and fed it to the fire after she nodded that she had memorised it. At 20 minutes past noon, Henry's temperature climbed. Rebecca felt it before the thermometer confirmed it. A dry heat under skin that had been clammy an hour earlier. She sent for cool water, loosened the blanket at his chest, and began sponging wrists, neck, and temples in measured intervals. Mrs. Davies brought fresh cloths without being asked. "You have done this before," the housekeeper said quietly. "Through winter fevers in tenant cottages," Rebecca answered, "when the village surgeon was drunk or delayed." Mrs. Davies absorbed that without surprise. "Then I shall have more basins ready." By 1 o'clock the fever held but did not spike. Henry dozed, woke, wept, and slept again in short cycles. Each time he surfaced, he searched for Rebecca first. Each time she answered before he could panic. "Here! I am here. Do not move your shoulder. Breathe and count." Arden came and went with the rigid pace of a man used to battle reports, not sick rooms. He stood at the door, left, returned 10 minutes later, left again. He spoke little. Once he asked, "Pain?" Henry shook his head no, because he feared disappointing him. Rebecca corrected the lie before it hardened. "He has pain," she said calmly, meeting the Duke's eyes. "He also has fear." Arden's jaw tightened. "What do you require?" "Quiet, predictable voices. No sudden touch from strangers." He turned to the servants in the corridor. "You heard." No one slammed a door for the next 2 hours. By the second hour past noon, Rebecca's back ached from holding still. Her left heel throbbed inside the borrowed slipper. Blood from the morning blister had dried to stiffness. She did not shift. Henry had finally sunk into deeper sleep, with his head against her thigh and his injured arm secure in the sling. If she moved too soon, he would wake in pain. So she remained where she was, one hand resting lightly over the bandage to feel for any dangerous slide. Arden entered once more and stopped just inside the threshold. She sensed him there, but kept her eyes on the child. "You should rest," he said. "He should rest first." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have." Silence stretched. Fire snapped in the grate. "Why help him?" Arden asked at last. "You had no obligation." Rebecca looked down at Henry's damp curls against the blanket. "He could not breathe. That is all. It is enough." He held that answer like a blade turned in his hand, testing edge and weight. Then he inclined his head once and withdrew without another word. At 2:30, Henry woke, shaking from a fever dream, and tried to sit upright. Pain hit instantly. He cried out and fought the sling, wild with fright. Rebecca caught his wrists, not hard, only firm enough to keep him from harming himself. "Henry, look at me. You are in your uncle's house. Your arm is safe. Count with me." He could not. His breath came too fast. She recognized the rhythm of panic, the body convinced it was drowning again, though air was present. She lowered her voice to the cadence she had once used for a tenant girl after a barn fire, slow and even, each word placed like a stepping stone. "Find my hand. Good. Squeeze once for yes, twice for no. Is this your room?" One squeeze. "Oh no, is your shoulder held?" One squeeze, then a sob. "Does your chest hurt?" 2 squeezes. "Good. Then we begin. In. Hold. Out. In." His breathing followed by degrees. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it followed. When he could listen, she reached for the Latin primer lying on the side table, its corners chewed from earlier years. "Shall we outrun pain with grammar?" He gave a wet, uncertain laugh that broke in the middle. "You are cruel." "Yes," she said. "Decline mensa." He groaned. "Mensa, mensae, mensae, mensum." "Better," she said, and turned the page. "Again." She read and he repeated, stumbling, correcting, insisting on finishing each line even when tears started again. The exercise gave his mind a rail to hold. Fever loosened him. Habit pulled him back. Rebecca kept the pace exact, never too fast for breath. She did not know Arden had returned until a floorboard sounded near the half-open door. She glanced up once and saw only the edge of his coat, and the stillness of a man who did not wish to interrupt. He remained there through 3 pages of declensions, and a short passage from Caesar rendered into clumsy schoolboy English. He did not speak. He did not move. At 3 o'clock the fever broke, not all at once. Sweat cooled along Henry's hairline. His skin lost its frightening heat. His hands unclenched. Rebecca changed the damp pillowcase, rechecked the sling, and coaxed him to drink watered broth in spoonfuls. Mrs. Davies returned with fresh lamps and paused when she saw the thermometer. "Down! Down!" Rebecca confirmed. The housekeeper let out a breath she had likely held since morning. "I shall send word below." Henry's lashes fluttered. He looked toward the door where his uncle stood, partly hidden by shadow. "Will he stay?" Arden stepped forward then, crossing the room in 3 long strides. "Yes?" Henry reached for him with his good hand. The Duke took it, awkward at first, then steadier as the child's fingers settled around his thumb. Rebecca looked away to give them privacy. That rank could not command and grief could not teach. After a moment, Henry's grip loosened. He drifted back to sleep, this time without jerking awake. Rebecca eased herself from the bedside inch by inch, prepared to stand for the first time in hours. Pain shot through her heel when weight returned. She caught the bedpost and masked the wince too late. Arden saw. "Sit." "I am able." "Sit." She sat. Mrs. Davies placed a stool under her injured foot without comment and set a small bowl beside it. Warm water, clean cloth, salve that smelled of camphor and rosemary. Practical mercy offered as task. Rebecca cleaned the cut quickly, embarrassed by the attention, and bound it herself. No one pretended not to notice. No one mocked. The absence of contempt felt so unfamiliar it hurt more sharply than the wound. By the time the long case clock in the corridor struck 4, rain had thinned to mist. The room held the muted peace of danger past, but not forgotten. Henry slept with regular breath. The splints sat true. The fever had not returned. The first true stillness of the day settled over Rebecca like a blanket she did not trust. Arden remained near the window, profile cut against grey light. He had sent men to court, to registry, to magistrates. He had issued commands that would move paper and power by evening. Yet here, in the quiet after crisis, he watched a sleeping child and the woman who had kept him alive, and said nothing at all. Rebecca folded her hands in her lap to hide their tremor. She had come to probate, expecting erasure. She had spent 6 hours in a duke's private chamber with a child who would have died in a corridor if she had waited for permission. The world had not turned fair in a single day. It had only cracked wide enough to show that witness could alter fate when law and courage arrived in the same hour. At the door, a footman appeared with another sealed packet and bowed low. "From Chancery, Your Grace, the Deputy Registrar awaits your instruction." Arden took the packet, but did not break it yet. His gaze rested on Rebecca, direct and unreadable. "Do not leave this house," he said. "Not until I return." "On what authority, Your Grace?" Rebecca heard the question leave her mouth before caution could retrieve it. Her voice was low, but it carried in the quiet room. Mrs. Davies went still beside the washstand. The footman at the threshold kept his eyes fixed on the silver salver, as if it were scripture. Arden broke the packet seal with his thumb and read the first page standing where he was. Water from the hem of his coat marked the carpet in dark crescents. His face did not alter as he read, but the scar at his temple tightened. "On the authority of an active fraud inquiry," he said. "On the authority of a child nearly dying in public while grown men watched. On the authority of seeing you struck," he folded the paper once. "And on mine." The last 2 words were not raised. They landed harder than a shout. Rebecca held his gaze. I was served to vacate by sunset. If I do not return, Mrs. Webber will dispose of my trunk before dark." "Then your trunk is retrieved by my men under witness," he said. "You will not return to that house alone." He turned to the waiting footman. "Tell the deputy registrar I will receive him in the West Library in 15 minutes. Tell Mr. Carter to send 2 clerks and 1 constable to Weber House with inventory forms. Nothing is touched without list and signature. If resistance is offered, they call on Bow Street at once." "Yes, Your Grace." "And send a maid with writing materials to this room. Good ink, sand, 2 clean folios." The footman bowed and vanished. Mrs. Davies moved to the door in his wake, then paused. "Shall I remain, Your Grace?" "Remain," Arden said. "No one enters without your word." She inclined her head, understanding the order beneath the order. Guard the room, guard the woman in it. Rebecca felt heat rise under the skin of her throat. Anger and relief braided so tightly she could not separate them. "I am not accustomed to being confined." His eyes came back to her at once. "You are not confined. You are shielded until process catches up with malice. Those are not always different things." For the first time, something like weariness crossed his face. "In many houses, no. In this one, yes." Henry shifted in sleep, a small restless sound breaking between them. Rebecca leaned to check the sling. The knot held. His fingers were warm. His breathing remained even. Arden stepped nearer the bed, one hand braced on the bedpost as if to steady the room rather than himself. How long before he wakes in pain again? Perhaps 1 hour, perhaps less. She adjusted the blanket at Henry's hip. If he wakes frightened, he will move too quickly. The shoulder may slip. "Then you stay with him." It was another command. It was also what she already meant to do. A maid arrived with a writing case and left as quickly as she came. Arden set the folios on the small desk near the window and spread the packet from Chancery beside them. Rebecca watched his hands as he sorted papers by size and seal, exact and swift, like a field officer laying out maps before dawn. He selected 1 sheet and crossed back to her. "Your notice?" She touched her cuff by reflex. The folded paper was still there. She drew it out and passed it to him. He read in silence. His jaw hardened by degrees. "Defective service," he said at last. "No proper witness. Executor claim asserted before grant. Threat language outside lawful form." Rebecca blinked once. "You read tenant notices." "I read coercion." He folded the paper on its original lines and held it out again. "Keep this. It is evidence." She took it, careful not to brush his fingers. "Thank you." "Do not thank me for naming what is obvious." "To me, yes," she said. "Not to many rooms." Something shifted in his expression then. Not warmth, not softness, but recognition edged with anger that was not directed at her. He looked at her bruised wrist where the borrowed sleeve had fallen back. His voice dropped. "I watched that corridor from the arch before I reached you. I saw her raise her hand." Rebecca went very still. "I saw you keep hold of the box while she tried to take it," he continued. "I saw you choose procedure while they tried spectacle. I saw you go to the child when others stepped away." He paused. "I have not forgotten 1 second of it." The room seemed suddenly smaller, the fire louder. Rebecca pressed her palm against the bedspread to keep her hand from trembling. She had spent years being observed only for faults. The precision of this witness felt like standing too near a flame after winter. Mrs. Davies, practical and merciful, intervened by action rather than speech. She set a fresh cup of tea on the side table and nudged it toward Rebecca's reach. "Drink while it is warm, miss." Rebecca obeyed because disobedience would have been foolish pride. The tea was strong and bitter. It steadied her. Arden pulled the desk chair to the bedside and sat, not lounging, not at ease, both boots planted, forearms on his knees, gaze on Henry's sleeping face. He did not look toward the door. He did not ask for privacy. He simply remained as if leaving before the child woke was not available to him. Minutes passed in the rhythm of the mantel clock and Henry's breath. Rebecca felt each minute in her back and heel. The room's warmth reached her slowly, like a language she had once known and lost. A soft knock sounded. Mrs. Davies opened the door one span. A liveried messenger bowed from the hall. "From the West Library, Your Grace. The Deputy Registrar has arrived. Also Mr. Carter has departed with clerks and constable for Webber House. He requests to know whether Miss Webber's effects are to be removed to Arden immediately." Arden did not rise. "Yes, to the East Steward's rooms, locked. Mrs. Davies holds the key. It will be done. And the registry packet?" "In the library safe, sir. Logged." "Good. Tell the Deputy Registrar he waits 10 minutes. When the messenger withdrew, Rebecca turned toward him. "You delay an officer of Chancery for me." "I delay him for my nephew's shoulder and for an affidavit that must be exact," he said. "He can wait 10 minutes. She wanted to argue that dukes did not arrange their afternoons around women like her. The words would have been both true and useless. Instead, she said, "What affidavit?" "You saw attempted document seizure. You received unlawful notice. You discovered the absent entry. You will state all of it in your own hand while memory is clean." "I can do that now. After you drink the tea." She almost refused again. Then she saw the line of strain at his mouth and the held tension in his shoulders, the posture of a man running on discipline with nothing left to spare, and she lifted the cup without another word. By the time the clock marked the next quarter hour, Henry stirred. His lashes lifted. Confusion flooded his face first, then pain. He made a small choking sound and tried to roll toward his injured side. Rebecca was already there, one hand at his sternum, one supporting the sling. "No turning. Stay with me." "Hurts," he whispered. "I know." Arden rose and came to the other side of the bed. "Henry!" The boy's eyes found him and filled. "Do not go." 3 words. Child small. Absolute. Arden froze with his hand half lifted, as if some old muscle memory had given an order his body would no longer obey. He lowered himself to sit on the mattress edge, careful not to jar the bed. "I am here." Henry's breathing hitched. "Promise." "I promise." The answer came without pause, without qualification. Rebecca looked down at the bandage to hide what moved through her face. Henry held his uncle's sleeve in his good hand and stared at Rebecca with fever-bright eyes. "Read." "You have no mercy," she said softly. "Even wounded you demand declensions." A weak, ghost-thin smile touched his mouth and vanished. She reached for the primer and began again, voice quiet, steady, placing each Latin ending like a rung on a ladder out of pain. Henry repeated. Arden remained exactly where he was, unmoving except when the child's fingers slipped and needed his sleeve again. 2 pages later, Henry slept against the pillow with his mouth slightly open, tears dried in pale tracks at his temples. Rebecca set the primer down. Arden did not stand. The fire settled. Rain thinned to occasional taps on glass. In the hush, Rebecca heard her own pulse and the faint scratch of pen from somewhere far below, where clerks and registrars waited for signatures that would decide the shape of estates and lives. Yet, in this room, none of that moved until the child's breath said it could. Mrs. Davies came forward with another folded cloth and checked Henry's brow. "Cooler." "Hold at this range," Rebecca murmured. "If he spikes, wake me at once." "You will not be far," Arden said, before Mrs. Davies could answer. "You write in the morning room beside this chamber. Door open." Rebecca turned to him. "You are still ordering me." "I am still keeping you where I can find you." The bluntness of it struck deep. No ornament, no apology. She set both hands in her lap. "Why?" The single syllable hung between them. He looked at Henry first, then at her. The grey in his eyes was darker in firelight, like water over stone at dusk. "Because I have buried enough people to know the cost of looking away," he said. "Because I watched a room decide you were disposable until you proved otherwise with your hands. Because if I had arrived 2 minutes later, my brother's son would be dead, and you would still have been turned into scandal for saving him." His voice roughened once, then flattened again into command. "I will not permit that outcome." Rebecca could not speak for a moment. She had heard promises before. They usually came scented with conditions. This one came like a military order issued to himself. Mrs. Davies, eyes on Henry's sling, said quietly, "Your Grace, the Deputy Registrar has waited near half an hour." Arden stood then, slowly as though leaving the bedside required decision rather than motion. He looked at Rebecca's bandaged heel, then at the desk with waiting folios. "You write only what you witnessed. No embroidery, no mercy for them either." He nodded toward her injured foot. "If that dressing bleeds through, Mrs. Davies changes it." "I can manage my own bandage." "I am aware," he said. "You did, poorly." A sharp retort rose and almost escaped. What stopped it was not fear. It was the faintest change at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, gone before she could be sure she had seen it. He moved to the door and paused with one hand on the frame. Without turning, he gave the line that could not be mistaken for duty alone. "No one in this city will lay hands on you again and call it correction." He looked back then, directly at her. "Not while I draw breath." The words entered her like cold air and fire at once. They were too large for gratitude, too dangerous for trust, too exact to dismiss. She managed, after a breath, "Your Grace, promises made in anger are costly." "I do not speak in anger," he said. "I speak in record." Then he was gone into the corridor with Mrs. Davies behind him to issue orders, and the room held only Henry's sleep, the banked fire, and the legal papers waiting on the desk like a second heartbeat. Rebecca sat very still, listening to the diminishing echo of Arden's steps on the stair. Her hand went to the folded notice in her sleeve, then to the first blank folio. She dipped the pen, steadied it over the page, and began to write the corridor exactly as it had happened. The raised hand, the torn hem, the child's broken breath, and the Duke's command that had opened into shelter. The nib scratched over thick folio in a steady line while Henry slept, and the fire dropped to red at the core. Rebecca wrote each fact as if she were balancing a ledger that would decide whether winter coal was bought or withheld. The hour, the corridor, the raised hand, the attempted seizure of the deed box, the service paper placed without lawful witness, the child choking, the sugared almond cleared, the sling improvised from her own hem, the physician's confirmation, the Duke's order for registry custody. When she reached the line about the bruise at her wrist, the ink blotted once. She sanded it, shook off the grit, and continued. A quarter-hour later, the door opened and remained open just as ordered. The Deputy Registrar entered with a clerk and Mrs. Davies behind him. He bowed to Rebecca, not deeply, but with the precise civility given to a legal witness whose words had become suddenly expensive. "Miss Webber, I require your statement in your hand, and then aloud for attestation." She passed him the folio. "It is complete to this moment." He read without haste. His eyes paused at 2 places only: the slanted witness line on the vacate notice and the sentence naming entry 74 absent from the private index. He looked up. "You observed the signature angle yourself?" "I copy accounts nightly," she said. "I notice hands." He gave the smallest nod and set the page before the clerk. "Read it back." The clerk read every line. Rebecca corrected 1 word, changing snatched to attempted seizure. Precision mattered more than fury. When the reading finished, the registrar turned the page and pressed the affidavit block toward her. "Sign!" She signed Rebecca Weber with no flourish. Another knock sounded. Carter stepped in, reins still on his shoulders, 2 mud-marked clerks behind him, and a constable at the rear. He bowed first to the registrar, then to Rebecca. "Report from Weber House," he said. "Entry granted under constable presence. No arrest required." Mrs. Weber protested and attempted to bar the attic stair, but stood aside when warrant authority was read. Inventory completed and witnessed. He handed over 3 tied packets and 1 small wooden chest. Miss Weber's trunk sealed, attic chest recovered from beneath bedding, 12 loose slips found in grammar books, in the same room, listed as personal papers. 1 silver comb wrapped in old flannel in the cloak lining, listed and returned. 1 private index, ribboned in blue, listed and returned. No estate papers removed by us except by order. The iron deed box transferred from probate chain to Arden's secure custody against receipt. Rebecca's throat tightened at the plain recital of objects she had guarded like contraband pieces of herself. The registrar checked each receipt, then asked, "Any damaged seals?" "None." "Any undisclosed packet?" Carter glanced once at Rebecca before answering. "1 packet in registry vault already under your seal, sir. Entry 74. Collected from Chancery and placed in Arden Library, safe, at 13 minutes past noon. Logged by me and by the Duke." Every report called earlier had found its return. By dusk, the West Library had become a chamber of paper and iron. The deed box sat open on the long table under 2 lamps. The registry packet lay beside it, court wax unbroken, until the registrar arrived with a magistrate's written leave. Arden stood at the head of the table in a dark coat, silent and motionless. Rebecca stood opposite, her bandaged heel wrapped in fresh linen, her hand resting on the back of a chair she didn't take. The registrar held up the packet for all present to see. "Supplemental codicil of Edmund Weber, filed and sealed. Opening now under witness." Wax cracked. Thread lifted, paper unfolded. Rebecca knew her father's hand at once, even before she read the line that named her. The strokes were thinner than in his healthy years, but exact. He had written in short clauses, each one built to survive challenge. "I intentionally omit my daughter Rebecca Weber from the public testament for her protection pending her 22nd year, to prevent coercive interference by my wife, Agnes Weber, whose conduct in debt matters I have reason to distrust." The next clauses were colder and clearer. Weber House and all unencumbered holdings were settled into an educational trust under Rebecca's sole authority upon reaching 22. Named trustees were temporary only and removable at her instruction. A schedule attached listed debt notes he believed forged or induced under incapacity, with dates that matched the slips hidden in grammar books. Rebecca did not realize she was gripping the chair until her knuckles whitened. She heard her father's voice in the legal cadence, weary but unbent. The registrar finished reading and laid the sheet flat. "This instrument is valid on its face. We proceed to magistrate hearing at first light." At dawn, the next day, rain struck the courthouse glass in fine, hard lines while the hearing room filled. Mrs. Weber entered in dark blue silk and pearl drops. her daughters behind her, faces set in brittle composure. She looked at Rebecca once, and then away, as if refusal to acknowledge could still erase. It could not. The magistrate heard first from the registrar on chain of custody, then from Dr. Vale on the corridor emergency and timing, then from Carter and the constable on the inventory at Weber House, then from Rebecca, who read her affidavit aloud without tremor. When the vacant notice was produced, the magistrate asked for witness verification. The named witness, summoned and pale, admitted he had not been present at service, and had signed later in Mrs. Weber's drawing room. The slanted line was no longer a small humiliation. It was proof. Old Mr. Hales, the retired clerk from behind the apothecary, appeared when called and set down a wrapped ledger volume with careful hands. He testified that Edmund Weber had consulted him privately about protective codicil filing and about suspicious signatures appearing on debt notes during periods of severe respiratory decline. He had advised dual filing and index separation. The room shifted at that. Strategy in absence? Confirmed. When pressed, Mrs. Weber denied forgery and called the debts necessary management. The magistrate ordered comparison sheets. 2 court examiners bent over signatures under magnifying glass and noon lamp. One finally spoke. Material divergence in pressure and terminal strokes on 7 notes. Signet impression valid. Hand not the same. The hearing ran past midday. By the 2nd hour after noon, judgment was entered. Fraud, coercive misrepresentation in estate administration, attempted unlawful dispossession of Rebecca Weber, asset seizure pending restitution, transport order from London under guard. Mrs. Weber's daughters wept then, not from innocence but from the sudden collapse of scaffolding they had mistaken for permanence. Mrs. Weber did not weep. She stared at Rebecca with the same cold disbelief she had worn the first day she called her dependent, as if law had committed a personal betrayal by refusing to remain decorative. Guards stepped forward. Silk rustled once, then receded down the aisle. 3 days later, with the court seal dry on every transfer page, Rebecca stood in the old steward's office at Weber House, while 2 clerks read aloud the final inventory of restored control. The iron deed box was placed in her hands and signed over. The private index and 12 slips were entered into trust archive. The silver comb went into her pocket, not the records chest. She walked upstairs to the attic room one last time, looked at the cold grate, the narrow bed, the window that leaked along the frame, and then closed the door without touching the latch again. By the 2nd week of November, she sat at a long table in Arden's estate office with maps spread beside account books, and drafted the charter for the village school endowment her father had described, but never lived to execute. She appointed a proper board. She fixed stipend lines for 2 teachers and 1 winter coal allocation that could not be diverted without trustee vote. She sent for cook from Weber House and offered her the school kitchen post at fair wage. Cook cried and accepted. Henry, arm healing in a neat sling, practised Latin across from her, and Miss declined Mensa with renewed confidence. Mrs. Davies corrected his posture with 2 fingers between shoulder blades, and the gesture struck Rebecca with such sudden tenderness that she looked down at her page until the ache passed. That evening, Arden entered the office after dismissing the last tenant petitioner. He set 1 folded paper beside her elbow, her formal appointment as legal steward of Arden Educational Holdings and the Weber Trust Integration Memorandum, already signed by counsel. "You have the first office now," he said. She read the page, then lifted her eyes. "And the second?" His gaze did not shift. "When you are certain it is not pity." She stood because answers like this were not given sitting. I am certain it is not pity." He inhaled once, held it, and let it go. The hard line of his mouth eased by a fraction. Not quite a smile. At St. George's, 6 months to the day after the probate reading, light fell pale through high windows onto stone and winter flowers. Rebecca wore no borrowed lace, only ivory silk chosen, and paid from her own account. Henry carried the ring cushion with solemn concentration. Mrs. Davies stood in the second pew and watched everything. Mr. Hales attended in his best coat, blinking often. Cook sat beside 2 village mothers whose children now recited letters in the schoolroom funded by the trust. When the vows were spoken, Arden's voice stayed low and exact, as it had in command, but the vow itself was not command. It was recognition freely given and freely met. Afterward, at the register table, Rebecca signed her name in a hand that did not shake. The rector sanded the line and nodded. Outside, bells rang over wet cobbles. No one laughed at her shoes. No one asked whether she was relation or servant. The record held. That night, before the house settled, she opened the iron deed box one final time in Arden's library and placed inside it the codicil copy, the affidavit, the inventory receipts, and the first school ledger marked balanced in her own hand. Then she set her mother's silver comb on top for one quiet breath, lifted it again, and closed the lid. When she turned, Arden waited by the fire, still as stone and no longer cold, and Rebecca Weber crossed the room toward the life she had chosen by name.